Hello, my dear magic friends out there. I'm your host, Bharat Jaguma here, and welcome back to my YouTube channel, Mallugic. So it's been such a great pleasure, and I'm really grateful for all these interviews that happened over the past 2 months. And today I'm really excited, and I'm kind of like sad as well. So that I will tell you the reason why I'm being sad. It's not just like I'm not like this will be the last international interview we will be doing in 2020. So it's not like the end. This is like a stepping point. This is not the stopping point. I remember one great man said me these words. So yeah, so I will definitely do this much of interviews, like as a season two, in the January or next year. But for now, in 2020, this will be the end of season one. So you guys remember how it all started? I think most of the Indian magicians told me that we did a total of 29 interviews till now with the great performance all over the world, and this happens to be the 30th interview. And I'm really humbled, and I am really sure that all these interviews happened just because these interviews were started with the greatest living legend in magic and the one and only Michael Ammar. So I really wanted this to end. I really want to end the season one with him as well. So I asked him, I texted him that can we do a session again, and he was so kind to like agree with me to have a session again. So right here we have the one and only, the legendary, the greatest living legend, and the best magic teacher in the world. That is Michael Ammar. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm fine. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too. I remember, like in the first interview, you told me that it's not like a stopping point; it's a stepping point. These words I remember. So I really think this interview will be a stepping point for more in the season two.
Wonderful. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. All right, all right. So with that said, first of all, once again, thank you so much for accepting the invitation. So with that said, let's start the session. So today we are asking the questions we actually missed out to ask in the first interview.
Hmm.
So yeah, with that said, let's start the session. So we know that there are like a different presentation style in order to do magic. In the way we do close-up magic, it will be different, and the way we do stage magic will be different. And there are some brilliant magicians who can handle both of them, like
Hmm.
the way they handle close-up and the way they will handle stage. They are too expert in that. I mean, like we know you as well. Let's take the example of you. When you are doing close-up magic, the style will be different. But when you are coming on stage, you have that charisma. You have that. You open up yourself. We have talked about that. So let me ask you something. How can a beginner magician take their close-up magic? Like in close-up magic, the people will be less, or let's say the street magic, the people will be less, right? But how can a beginner magician take those effects and make it play big on stage?
Well, I think the most fundamental thing that's happening when you perform magic is communication. There's something that you have to get into somebody else's mind, that has to be very clear. And at the same time, you have to be concealing some things, and you have to make some things seem really important, and you have to gloss over some things. So that whole act of communication is the most fundamental that's taking place. And with magic, I think probably the most important element in that communication is your body language, is the nonverbal language, the things that you say with your face and with your body and with your gestures. And for me, it's always an exercise in trying to communicate everything as clearly as possible with my body, and to really try to make sure that the far corners of the room can understand what's being said and what's being communicated in the sequence that it's being communicated. So I think that learning close-up magic first can help your stage magic, because you start to understand what's important at any given time. They have to know that this is a shuffle deck. They have to know that's a freely selected card. They have to know that the card is lost in the deck. So all of those elements, can of understanding can enhance your stage magic, as long as you what's important, what's really important for them to know at any given time. And so when I perform on in a stand-up performance, and I'm doing something small, maybe I'm I always considered it just an exercise in trying to communicate these really small, simple things. I mean, I've done, just the rubber band magic, for 150 people. And I know that these people in the far area, they probably can't even see the rubber bands, So how can I communicate what's happening with my whole body, to play this really big and really large and use my whole body to, convey, okay, now they're together. They can't come through. Now they separate. I mean, I use my whole body to do that. And I do it at times when I know this may be difficult for some people to see, but for me, it's an exercise and learning to develop this skill with my body to communicate these small things in a very big way. And so, I mean, one time I was in Busan, South Korea, and 10,000 people, and it's an outdoor show. On the beach, so there's a lot of competition for people's attention. They have a giant screen behind me. It's like a drive-in theater screen behind me on the stage, and I tell them, I'm going to do the rubber band trick for 10,000 people and see if they can understand what's happening. And I found the camera, and I found it in a very clear way, and it played really big, and it got a great reaction for 10,000 people. And again, even though that was the event and I was performing then, I still considered it an exercise in developing that skill for the next time I perform in that situation. So really, it's just a matter of understanding what they need to be thinking at any given time, and how to communicate that with your body to make sure that it's really clear. And as long as you are a performer, you are working on that skill and developing that skill, and it's something that you'll always need every time you perform, is the ability to communicate with your whole body everything that's taking place. So for me, it's really an exercise in body language and communicating these small things in a very big way.
Perfect, perfect. And talking about communication, I remember in the first interview you told me that to be a master magician, you have to be a master communicator. So that's the key, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I really remember that. So yeah, let's move on to the next question. So talking about the effects that we do. So this also, like, I'm asking in a general way, because professional magicians and those who have experience know how to be selective, but I'm just asking this question for the beginner magicians to learn from this interview. So like, we know that today in magic market or in the medalist market, whatever, there are like thousands and thousands of effects, and many effects are actually similar from the classics. They adapt the classics ones, and they will actually put a twist on it, or they will have a different approach to it, or they'll have a different technique or method to do those classic effects.
Mm-hmm.
And also there are unique effects that are also coming, which are really, really unique at its core. So for a beginner magician, they will be confused. I mean, they just start learning it, right? So for a professional, they know what they need and what they want and what they want to accomplish. But for a beginner person, they will be confused, and they'll think, oh, this is cool, and they will see another electronic like magic or something. Oh, yeah, wow, this is crazy, and they'll be totally confused. So instead of wasting so much money on all those materials, how can they will be selective, and how can they know that which method or which effect will suit their style?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what a lot of people do is they learn whatever effects that they see and that's around them, and they accumulate these tricks in their repertoire. And after they have a body of this material, they say to themselves, now I wonder where I can perform these things, and so where they perform and what they perform, it's very, you know, it's just very random. There's no rhyme or reason to how they've learned these things, and now what they've learned affects where they're going to perform. I think it's a better idea to think carefully about where you're going to perform, Where am I going to do these things? Am I going to do it socially as I just walk around and take things out of my pocket? Am I going to do it in front of a classroom? Am I going to do it after dinner as I walk around? Am I going to be on a platform instead? But if you decide exactly where you're likely to perform, say this is the arena, the performance arena that I'm going to be collecting material for. Once you make that decision, that performance arena has all sorts of criteria associated with it. If you're just going to do street magic, you can't carry around a bunch of props and that sort of thing. If you're going to perform in restaurants, that's going to affect the material that you learn. So rather than to learn a bunch of stuff and then decide where you're going to perform, I think if you decide where you're going to perform first, then it becomes easier to collect material that's appropriate for that performance arena. That's just as a general piece of advice. Figure out where you're going to do this. And as soon as you really understand that, that's going to affect, 70 or 80% of the material that you see. And you can decide, well, I'm not going to need to learn this trick that uses 12 coins and has to have a surface and that sort of thing. So decide where you're going to perform, and that brings all kinds of criteria to the selection process. And as a general rule, when I was first starting out in magic, I would order individual tricks and I would buy individual tricks but then I would get a good book, and I would say, wow, there's all kinds of material in this good book. As a general rule, dollar for dollar, the best value that you're going to find is in a good book. And that's where you're going to get your most value per trick, instead of buying each trick, one trick at a time. That's what people are doing these days. When I did a few things for Penguin Magic, they said, we want 5 tricks from the Easy to Master series. And we'll sell those as individual tricks. And those individual tricks sold for $15 or $20. Whereas if you had the original video or the original DVD, you could get 12 tricks for the same price. Okay, but those individual one trick at a time became best sellers, even though they could have gotten 10 times as much for the same price if they just got the original thing. But they don't want to study 12 tricks and then decide which trick they want to do. They want to see one trick at a time, and I like that, I'll try that. I like that, I'll try that. And that's just the nature of the beast. You want to perform what you've seen done. You don't want to have to use your own judgment to take a book and visualize how that would work. Whereas once you really develop an understanding of your performance arena and your own skill set and that sort of thing, a book is all you need, and then you use your own judgment. What appeals to you about this trick, and how does that fit your performance style and stuff like that. But everybody goes through that process of just collecting whatever tricks they've been exposed to, rather than I'm researching for a specific style of magic. And they collect all these tricks that they've just recently seen, and they think this is my repertoire, when really it's just such a random process that brings those tricks into it. But once you decide this is where I'm going to work, I'm going to search for tricks that fit that criteria and that performance arena, I think your selection process just becomes a lot easier, a lot more effective.
All right. And yeah, talking about books, when you said about books, like we know this fact, this is completely true though, because if we learn one magic trick, yeah, we know the secret of that. But if we get a good classic magic book, we will get a lifetime full of ideas. We can take ideas and principles and methods from that and adapt it into our routine. So we know that magic books, especially the classic, old, very good books, are gold. They're for like a lifetime full of ideas, right? So we know the fact that if you read magic books, not just by reading, but if you deeply understand what's written in the book, then we will have a lot more knowledge about the magic theory, and a lot more, we'll be more creative in terms of the knowledge. But let me ask you something. Apart from reading magic books, if you start reading philosophy books, if you start reading books about life, in your perspective, does that make a performer a great person?
Oh, I definitely think that you need to explore all sorts of other, I used to like to read books on the mind and what people remember and what they notice and what they don't notice and what they care about and how to develop emotional hooks so that, people can relate to what you're talking about. Things on language and body language and stuff like that. I think that those are always as interesting as any, as far as affecting your performance and your performance style, and that sort of thing. One of the really good magic books that I read in the last 15 or 20 years is called Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. Understanding Comics. And all it is just about the process of using that medium to communicate a story. And just one of the really insightful things that I got out of that book was that the medium of a comic book, where you have a square and a square, 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 the most interesting thing that's happening in that process is what happens in between those two blocks, those two photos, or images. That's called the gutter in between those, because in that space in between those two, that's where the reader participates with his own imagination. He fills in that gap with his own imagination. And that's why anybody that's read the comic book or the book before they see the movie, they think that the book is better. And the reason they think the book is better is because they co-created that work. And they use their imagination to fill in those blanks. And so naturally that it becomes more personal. Now, what that said to me as a performer, I used to think all magic has to be visual. They have to be able to see what's happening. They have to, the more visual, the better. But that made me realize that there's room for the cerebral side of magic, just what they think at any given time. And so I learned to invite their imagination into the process. When you just cast a shadow over something, they're imagining, well, what does that mean? How does that affect anything? What does that have to do with anything? If I do a double lift and then I just turn the card over and it's changed, it's not as interesting as if I do a double lift and I put it on the table and I say, rub the card, a little bit harder. Now turn it over. And now it's changed. The fact that they've participated, that they've had to do something a little different. Well, what does that mean? Why did I have to rub it again? I wonder what that changes is. Maybe it's heat. Maybe it's some sort of friction that causes the effect. So that just invites their imagination to participate in it. And that's one of the little things that I got out of a non-magic book. It's a book on comic, how to read comic books. And yet that whole process of learning to communicate in that medium, it can be transferred to learning to communicate magic to an individual or a group.
Perfect, perfect. So talking about books, just one more question about books is that for a beginner magician, what are the qualities that you think a beginner magician or an intermediate magician needed to write a magic theory book?
Well, you really have to understand that magic only happens inside somebody's mind. It doesn't happen with the techniques. It doesn't, it only happens when you communicate a very specific thing into somebody's mind. And, unless you really understand that that's the only place that magic happens, is in the mind of a viewer. You start to realize the responsibility that you have to communicate very specific things and to conceal very specific things. And how to manage all of that is what magic theory is all about. That whole process of making sure that they think a certain thing at a certain time. And, that whole process really requires a very empathic sort of understanding of what's taking place. It's not so much how to do the techniques. It's how to make them think certain things at certain times, and so I think that whole understanding of the viewing mind is probably the most important thing. If you're really going to try and understand the philosophy of magic, you're understanding the philosophy of the human mind and the communication process. That's really what makes magic. And that's where magic happens.
Perfect. Yeah. And this is one of the interesting thing, because when magicians say the name of Michael Ammar, first thing that comes to them is charisma. Your charisma is like beyond our imagination. The way you walk on stage, the way you perform magic. So how do we find and get charisma in our performance?
Well, again, I think that's part of understanding the nature of body language and understanding, when does communication really begin? It doesn't begin when you speak your first sentence. It begins as soon as you're in their line of vision. And the way that you hold your body and the way that you open yourself up, and your body language is up and out and open and receptive. And, but they are processing your body language without even realizing it themselves. They don't really think, here's what I'm doing. I'm looking at the way he moves. I'm looking at the way he appears. I'm looking at the way his face is responding to the situation. They don't think in those terms, but that's what's happening. They're processing information from the second that you're in their line of vision. And I taught a magic class one time where we videotaped people walking up onto the stage, saying hello, and starting their first trick. So, okay, that's it. You don't have to complete the trick. And we videotaped each person doing that. Then afterwards, we watched these things. And okay, just you're walking out. Now, what do we know about this person? He hasn't said anything yet, but we realized that that they didn't tuck their shirt in, that they are kind of walking like they're, and they're dropping their deck, card box on the table. And, we're processing all of that information before they said anything. And then we said, well, now how can we have communicated something different? And that whole process before you even start to speak and start to perform. Well, you could walk out in a certain way. You can say hello in a certain way. You can speak with your eyes and your face and your smile. Those things are the last things that people think about. They think that it's all about learning how to control the card, or how to hold the break, or whatever. And that becomes the least important thing that's going on, when it comes to really communicating how you're feeling and what you want them to think and that sort of thing.
All right, perfect. Yeah. And talking about, we asked this question in terms of your charisma, right? And also I'm going to ask you this question in terms of your teaching style. So, we know that everyone in this world, most of the people wants to know how a trick is done, but not everyone wants to be a magician. And not every magician can be a great magician. And the interesting thing is that not every great magician can teach magic in the right way, because it's a whole different thing, right? So in order to be a great magic teacher, so let's say if you are a great performer, if we are very good at what we perform, but in order to teach magic in the right way, that's a different thing. So in your perspective, how can a magician be a great magic teacher? I'm not asking how can be a magician to be a great magic teacher like you, because there is only one and only Michael Ammar in the world. Nobody can be like you. But what's the tip you can give to the magicians to be a great magic teacher?
Well, I think it helps to remember what it's like, not to know something is done. I remember what it was like to not know how something is done. As a kid in West Virginia, I didn't have any magic mentors in my town. I didn't have, a big magic shop that I could go to. I remember what it was like to not know how something was done. And reading a book or something like that, what did I need to know to really understand how to do that effect? And I just remember what it was like to really not know how something was done. Now explain it to me in a way that I can understand. And so I just imagine that I'm talking to myself. I would sit in my basement in West Virginia wondering how a trick is done. Well, here's how it's done. The first thing you have to do is to have you have to hold the deck in the right way so that when you do this, they know how to pick the card and they know what's happening. I just remember what it would be like, to be the person sitting there wanting to know how it's done. And so you just learn to explain it in a clear way.
All right, perfect. And yeah, let's move on to the next question. So talking about performance, not only the performance or not only our costume or not only our humor, script is one of the most important thing in the performance, the script that we use for the show, right? So let's say, so this is most of the magicians say that we need to have a basic script for the show. But let's say a performer is able to deliver natural dialogues and they don't need a script. Let's say they don't need a script and they will entertain the people spontaneously on the spot with such natural lines. Then is it necessary for that person to have a prepared script for the show?
Well, not necessarily. I think there are some effects where the exact words are important, and so there are a couple of effects where I had to carefully think about exactly what's being said, go from this point to this point to this point, and so there are certain cases where I really figured out each word. But as a general rule, whenever I tried to script what I was going to say, I typically wrote twice as much as I felt comfortable saying. And here's my script, and I've learned it, and I go out and I start talking, and I realize I'm not doing anything now. I'm just talking because I wrote this script, and so I wrote, okay, I need to eliminate this. I need to eliminate this. I need to tighten this up. So as a general rule, I always would write, more than I ended up feeling comfortable saying. But it was nice to have some idea of what I was going to say. So as a general rule, what I do is I get a loose idea of what I'm going to say. And then I find a place to perform it in front of an audience so that I can think about it and actually do it and learn how much more I need to say in order to fill out this performance, and then later, okay, I need a line here and I need a line here. But to write too much a lot of times, and a lot of times if you've written it out for each word, and now you're delivering a memorized thing, it's really hard for that to sound natural and conversational. It starts to sound like you're saying something that's memorized. And I think that it's real important for what you're saying to seem authentic for then and now, and so an overly memorized script, I think comes across in an artificial way. Whereas if you just got a loose idea of what you're going to say and then you're talking, it comes out more natural. Like some people, they think that I've got a script where it says, "Hello, my name is Michael Ammar. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for being here." And they write out how they're just going to say hello. Hello, I'm Michael Ammar. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's good to see. And it just comes across as a very cookie cutter experience. And people start to think, well, he would say the same stuff whether we're here or not. And I don't think that's a good idea. I think that it's good if they think, wow, he's really talking to us right here, right now. That's very authentic. I had a joke that I thought this was funny. I had a rubber stamp made up that just says sincerely, you know. And I thought, well, that's funny because how insincere can you get than a rubber stamped sincerely, sincerely. And I thought this was funny when these guys would say, "Hey, sign my lecture notes." I go, "Okay, best wishes, okay, sincerely." And they didn't get it. A lot of guys didn't get it. They go, "Oh," I go, "Wait, isn't that funny? It's a rubber stamp sincerely." And they go, "Oh yeah, yeah, I guess that's funny." It didn't work out so much, but the idea of that, what comes across when you are doing a really memorized script and an intimate situation. It's like a rubber stamp sincerely. It's like I'm going to pretend that I'm really here and I'm really talking to you, but what I'm really doing is giving you a memorized thing. And I think for it to be sincere, it has to be authentic in real time, and so that's the balance that you get. I mean, you want to have some idea of what you're going to say, but if it comes across as too memorized and too processed, then they realize they might as well be watching a YouTube video as to watch this guy do his memorized thing here. So I've always felt like it was important that they realize, okay, he's really talking to us and he's really looking at us, and this is authentic for us and here and now, and those are the elements that are important, I think. But scripting, sometimes every word is important. You know, I used to do a trick with coins, and each coin meant something. You know, and was something that my grandfather used to talk about. You know, and when he would give me coins, he said, a dime. It's only half as tall as a nickel, but it's worth twice as much. You know, sometimes people are like that. You know, never judge by appearances alone. You know, and that kind of thing. And so each word actually had to mean something for each coin, and that kind of thing. So that was a processed script, but it was part of what the plot of the trick was. My grandfather gave me a coin collection, but it's just a quarter and a nickel and a dime and a penny. I saved these because each one of these coins used to remind me of something he used to say. You know, and then I would talk to him, and so the fact that some of these things would come across as things my grandfather used to say, then it was appropriate to say exactly what he used to say. But it was built into the framework of that trick. But yeah, I think that you want to have some idea of what you're going to say so that you're not repeating yourself and that sort of thing. But to overly script everything has its own consequences, I think.
All right, perfect. Yeah. So yeah, there is one question in our list. When I said perfect, I remembered that question. So talking about perfect or talking about perfection, there's a saying that practice makes perfect. I think practice makes perfection. But there is another saying that perfect practice makes perfection. But there are like a different perspective of this statement. Some magicians say that we need to be perfect. In order to be a great magician, we need to be perfect at what we do. And there is another view on this, that nobody is perfect in this world. It's just that you are getting better than yesterday. So there are different point of view or different angles on this certain statement. But let me ask you something, sir. How do we know that we have gained perfection? Because to be perfect at what we do, we have to have years of experience. We have to do that particular thing more than many years. Then we might think that we are perfect. But if that performer thinks that they gained that perfection, then does he have to stop practicing that particular thing? So if they think that they made the perfection, does that person have to stop at practicing and continue with new things, or do we have to daily practice it again? In your perspective.
Well, I recall one time I was going to California to spend time with the professor, Di Vernon, and I wanted to impress him with something I was working on. So I decided to learn this burn and wand spin, the die burn and wand spin. And I spent a couple of months working on this wand spin. And when I get out there, so check this out. And I do this, and he goes, "What is that?" It's your wand spin. No, that's not it at all. No, I got it right out of the book. I followed every line in the book. You're not wrong in the book. It's all wrong in the book. And it's all wrong in the book. He said, let this be a lesson to you. He said, first you have to thoroughly understand before you rehearse, or you're just hurting yourself. Every time you rehearse, you're learning something the wrong way. So in that case, I had to unlearn what I had spent 2 months learning and relearn it in a slightly different way. And that was one of the more difficult things that I had to do, was this unlearning and then relearning of something. And that's when he made the point. He says, practice doesn't make perfect. It makes permanent. If you're rehearsing something the wrong way, you're only hurting yourself the more you rehearse. Only perfect practice makes perfect. And that was an important insight to me. Okay, you really have to understand what you're learning, or each rehearsal is just hurting you. But yeah, I think that perfection, boy, what does it ever mean? You really have to learn to keep thinking about what you're doing. And particularly the things that you've been doing for a long time, because, a lot of times we just find the way that works and we just keep doing it that way. But, sometimes it's really helpful to go back and look at the things that you've done for a long time. And now, is this really the best way to go into this? Is this really the best way to come out of it? And again, thinking about the professor, when it comes to scripting, just to go back a point, he would just say, how do you go into it? And how do you come out of it? Those are two of the most important things to really try and script and figure out exactly. What are you going to say to go into this? And what are you going to say when you're done to transition into something else or something like that? So really, those are the two of the most important things, to really have down and perfected. How are you going to set the effect up and hook them into watching it, and then when you're done, what's your thing that you're going to say to kind of show that it's over. So but yeah, perfection, there's some things that I've been doing for 30 or 40 years or more that I end up changing at some point, after 30 years. Okay, actually this is going to be better if I fix this like this, and I can do this in this way. So yeah, it's important to go back and look at the things you've been doing for a long time to make sure that that you're not just doing it the same way because that's the way it's always been done. There's a famous story about this woman who's getting ready to cook this piece of meat for Thanksgiving, and she would always cut the end of the meat off and cook it beside the rest of it. And one time the husband says, why do you always cut the end of the meat off like that? And the woman says, well, that's because that's the way my mother always did it. And well, let's call your mother, why she did it that way. I noticed that you always cut the end of the meat off and cook it on the side. Why do you do that? And she goes, well, I do that because that's the way my mother did it. And it's like, well, let's call Grandma and see why she does it that way. And so they called the grandma. How come you always cut the end of the ham off and you cook it beside when you cook it in? And she goes, oh, I do that because my pan is too short, And so there's 3 generations that have been doing it the same way because the one woman's pan was too short, and now they've got bigger pans and bigger ovens, but they're still doing it the same way because, I don't know, that's the way so-and-so always did it. So there's a good reason for looking at things that you've always done a certain way, just to make sure that you're doing it that way for a legitimate reason,
All right. And one thing which you said is really true, because learning is easy, but in order to unlearn what he have learned, that's the challenging and hardest part. Yeah, that's true though. Yeah, I totally agree with it. And I don't want to take too much of your time, so we will just end up the session with one more question. So we know that we are going through this hard times, this pandemic situation. So how can a magician keep his magic alive in this hard time? What's your thought on this?
Well, magic has always required
Yeah.
the professionals to be, innovative and nimble and to change. I think we may have talked about it last time, but in the last 40 years, magic has changed several times in
Yes.
a completely different way.
Yes.
Whether comedy clubs are coming into it, or trade shows are coming into it, or private parties are coming into it. It's like every 5 or 10 years, if you aren't able to completely change your approach and do what you're doing kind of in a different marketplace,
Hmm.
then you haven't survived for 30 or 40 or 50 years as a performer. And that's completely different than it was 50 years ago, 50 or 60 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. You used to be able to come up with an 8-minute act or a 10-minute act and do that same act your whole life and never have to change anything. But that's very, very rare. Vaudeville lasted 20s, 30, maybe 30 years, these small theaters, live performances, and then television kind of came along, and there were guys that were masters at that vaudeville arena that said, I don't ever want to be on television, because if I record my 10 minutes on television, now everybody in the world has seen that 10 minutes. What am I going to do? I have to get a new act. And that was just the nature of that beast. You could find one thing, and if you mastered that one thing, you could do it for a lifetime. That's not the way it is anymore. I'm
Yes.
probably the last generation that'll do the same kind of business his whole life. I've been a magician, 45 years, and my children will probably change their jobs 5 or 6 or 7 times in the course of a lifetime. The students going to college now, when they graduate, 30 or 40% of the jobs that are hiring didn't exist when they started to college. So how can you pick a specialty in college when really everything is going to change in 4 or 5 years? So we're just in a different situation than we've ever been, that really requires a performer to regularly think. I mean, what's going on right now is something that nobody could have imagined. I mean, it's one thing for trade shows to come and go, but for a situation where, okay, we're not going to put people in a small room sitting next to each other to watch a show for the next year.
Yes.
How are you going to survive during that year when you're not able to, when nobody's going to get together in a small room? They may not get together in a small room next year. So that's where all these Zoom things have started to come into the picture. Yeah. And I mean, nobody could have seen this. I used to think, well, it may seem like, I'm in a dangerous situation by learning magic, but I should be able to perform even if all theaters close. I can go on the street corner and start performing, develop a crowd, pass the hat. It never occurred to me that, but what if people aren't going to go out? What if people aren't going to get together? What if they're only going to do things on the telephone or online? So, I mean, this is a really unique situation that we're in. And it'll be interesting to see how many professionals survive for the length of time that they have to, modify what they're doing. I've resisted doing the Zoom shows. But I tell you, Zoom magic performances, I still do instructionals and, some private lessons and seminars and stuff like this online. But I haven't gone to to promoting and performing Zoom magic performances. But if this virus thing goes on for another, 6 months, you may see me advertising my Zoom magic shows just to survive as a performer in these crazy times. But you really have to be aware of what your marketplace is doing, where it's heading, because it always changes every 5 or 10 years anyway. This is a dramatic shift, but that's, dramatic shifts are going to happen as we keep going forward. Yeah.
So anyway, with that being said, thank you so much for doing this again. It's been such a absolute pleasure to have you for the end of season 1. And I really loved the way you answer all the questions, because this was an expected thing, because I know you will reply to all the questions in a very great way, in an amazing way. Yeah, so with that being said, I hope everyone who is watching right now enjoyed the session.
Let me address, something that, after the last performer, some guy was saying, hey, you're doing these things and you're broadcasting. Some of them are explaining how a trick is done and stuff like that. I don't think there's really much. I don't think there's any harm in it. The only people that are really going to sit down and watch an hour or 90 minutes of somebody talking about magic is that they have a natural interest in it. Every minute. There's like 100 hours of new content that's posted on YouTube every minute. So an hour from now, there's going to be 1,000 new hours of content. So there's so much competition for people's attention. There's no reason for them to feel like, well, geez, I might as well watch this guy talk about magic for the next 90 minutes. I don't have anything better to do. There's lots of content on everything that they're interested in. But if they spend an hour or 90 minutes listening to some guy talk about inside magic stuff, they're on their way to becoming a beginner. And so really it's people don't complain about magic books being in a library, because there's 1,000 other books on top of it. But on YouTube and Facebook and things like this, there's 10,000 hours on top of every hour. So it's as buried now as it ever was, if not more so, just because of the competition for content that's on these mediums.
Like I have talked about this thing with you, that the guy was mailing. Anyway, I'm not bothering about that. I'm just doing my own thing. Let him do his thing. That's it.
Who knows, if somebody sits and watches this one for an hour, maybe they'll think, maybe I should order some.
Yeah, that's true though. So anyway, that's it. Thank you so much.
Okay, it's been a pleasure. Maybe we'll see you next season.
Next season. Yeah.